what do you think the importance is of rehearsing these difficulties? Because I know the Stoics talked about this time and time again. It's like, hey, you want to not be afraid of poverty, practice being poor, and then you'll know that it's not actually that stressful and it's not bad at all. So what's the kind of rigorous routine that you would put through your students in order to get that strength and practice there?
Sure. And I think there's a really important sort of misconception of what you just said, which is that this sort of ability to respond to emergencies, to deploy a successful and strong emergency mind, happens as sort of a happy accident from training. And I don't actually think that's true. I think that you certainly cannot get a functioning emergency mind unless you practice in emergencies, but it's not just time on target. It's dedicated time on target, consciously training yourself. And you can easily put reps in without actually getting any better at it. If that wasn't the case, right, if it was just time on target, then always the oldest person in the room in the emergency would be the best at it. And that's not always true, right? And really, it's the person that's really invested themselves in sharpening their own mind and their own ability to do something. So I agree with you. It definitely has to be a conscious process in there. And I tend to think about this in terms of like multiple concentric circles, right? So there's like the what Stoics have to offer us in the exact second of pressure, uncertainty, and impact. And then what do Stoics have to offer us in the broader sense of how we train ourselves to prepare for this kind of thing. A great example of that is what you just said about thinking ahead about what's going to happen, right? This Stoic concept that I love but can never pronounce appropriately, like premeditatio malorum, or however you say that, right?
Or negative visualization, whatever
exactly,
you put it,
right? Exactly. So when I'm in a room and somebody's not breathing and I'm getting set up to intubate them, right? I'm going to put them to sleep. I'm going to put a breathing tube in their mouth. I'm going to hook them up to a ventilator, something we're all doing quite a bit of these days with the COVID epidemic, COVID-19. In that moment, I am doing premeditation malorum. I'm doing negative visualization in like the 1 or 2 moments leading up to actually paralyzing them. I'm looking at the person. I'm thinking, okay, what's going to go wrong here? What are my backup moves? What does their anatomy tell me? What does their physiology tell me? If this fails, what's my backup? If that fails, what's my backup? And I'm okay with that because I've practiced and rehearsed going for my backup tool. And I've visualized myself stumbling and recovering over and over and over again. We talk a lot about the idea of, okay, so just to really zoom in on this for a second. So you've paralyzed the patient, so they're not breathing. So it's up to you to breathe for them. They have a certain amount of time with which the oxygen they have in their body will sustain them, and then that will run out and they will die if you don't do anything. So let's say you go in and you put this little sort of curved blade, it's called a laryngoscope. It's not sharp, but you put it in their mouth to move the tongue out of the way so you can get the breathing tube in. And you set up to do that. If you see the vocal cords, great. You can get the tube in most of the time. Awesome. What if you don't? What if something doesn't quite work the right way? You have to adjust yourself on the fly within those couple of seconds, understand what the problem is, change your approach, and make a second pass that's going to succeed where the first pass failed. You have to understand that will happen some percent of the time. So ahead of that, you have to have thought about that. If you haven't thought about that, if you haven't done this negative visualization, man, you got a person that can't breathe and you're fumbling around trying to find the airway. That is an unpleasant situation. Conversely, if you think about it ahead of time, you rehearse the idea that you are fallible, you are not perfect, you will miss the first time. Some of the times you're going to train yourself to get ready to reach for that backup tool to make your adjustments and to move. At the same time, you zoom back out, right? And now all of a sudden you're thinking about emergencies in general, and you're thinking about the next 10 patients that are going to come in. What's going to happen? Is your team ready? Do you have enough resources? Do you have the backup resources? When this whole COVID-19 pandemic started, we had a screening program that only asked people if they'd been to Wuhan, China. Okay, that was a good first pass, right? And we were sort of shuttling them to different places based on how they answered that question. So my first response to that screening program was, oh, okay, well, what happens when we miss them at the first point? Right? What happens when they get through the first point and get into the ER? What do we do about it then? And I think that discipline of always thinking ahead about what the Stoics teach us about sort of imagine these bad things are going to happen and what you do about them, how do you respond, is invaluable for emergency care.